Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual book launch for If the Owl Calls by Sharon White. I'm Nairi Simonian, the publishing assistant for Betty Books, and I'll be your host this evening. I'm so excited you could all be here to help us celebrate the release of this awesome novel, which you can get by going to the WTAW Press website linked in the chat. Before we begin, let me introduce Betty and the women of the hour, Sharon White and Anita Felicelli. So, Betty is an imprint of WTAW Press, founded by Peg Alford Purcell and dedicated to publishing books by women for everyone. Our third title, If the Owl Calls by Sharon White, is a gripping literary mystery set in 1979 Norway during a time of environmental resistance and cultural awakening. As the Sami community fights to protect ancestral lands from the controversial Alta Dam, Oslo detective Hans Sorensen is sent to the far north to investigate a series of sabotage attacks. But when a body is discovered in a remote ravine, what seemed like a political act of defiance spirals into something far more complex, a case that will force Hans to confront his own past, his buried heritage, and the meaning of justice. Sharon White is an award-winning author whose work spans nonfiction, poetry, and fiction. She has written extensively about nature, place, and memory, bringing a lyrical and reflective voice to her storytelling. Her books include Monado Sketches, The Body is Burden and Delight, and many more. A passionate traveler, she draws inspiration from diverse landscapes and cultures. Anita Felicelli is the author of the short story collection How We Know Our Time Travelers, which was shortlisted for the Northern California Book Awards. Anita's other books include Chimerica, a novel, and the award-winning Love Songs for a Lost Continent. Her work has been recognized by the Greater Bay Area Journalism Award and the Los Angeles Press Club National A&E Awards. Now, I'll let Sharon take it away with the reading from If the Owl Calls.
Thanks so much, Nari. I'm going to read a short passage from the sort of the beginning of the book. Hans traveled from Alta to Lismavari in a US-made Huey helicopter with an ex-Army pilot, the kind he'd seen in the news from the failed American war in Vietnam. They flew close to the tops of the gnarled trees, the rocky outcrops, a crust of snow on most of the terrain, a white glow as they neared the river. He wanted to climb down into the ravine before the local cops moved the remains. 4 cops from Tanabru, already at the scene, were waiting for him. He was sure they were annoyed he was involved in the investigation. 2 were managing the ropes at the rim, 2 below to load the body onto the stretcher. They'd been waiting for an hour, young, laughing, even in rotten weather. He helped the 2 officers unload the stretcher, the body bag, and a pair of skis. His ski boots were in a pack on his back. His hands slipped down the orange rope as he balanced his legs, pushing off lightly on the wet rock. He was clipped into a harness with the carabiner. The rain sluiced into his mouth, down his face, seeped into his collar. He was more alive than he'd been in a long time. This is what it feels like, he thought, like sleet rushing through his veins. On the Vida in a gorge rappelling down to the river, 20 meters or so, a fierce river clotted with slush, half covered with ice, where it fell from the lip of the cliff. He could see the body by the edge of the pool, bent over the dark rocks. The 2 officers at the bottom leaned into the heavy mist. One was very tall and bearded, the other shorter with a pinched face. Their webbing harness belts were pulled over their ski clothes. Not in uniform? Hans laughed. In this weather? About time, the shorter cop said. How do you rate a ride in the copter? He crouched to unzip the body bag. Just one way, Hans said. No room with the body, is there? The other 2 cops on the rim of the ravine sent the stretcher down in a sling. There wasn't much to see, hardly any trace of what happened, but Hans moved closer to the body. and bent to look at the face, the hands, the coat. The face was yellow, thick like leather, then the arms and legs, the pieces of the torso pulled apart and worried by buzzards. Only doing their job, getting along, finding dinner. The coat, the boot, the fingers splayed out. The boots are the kind I've seen Russians wearing, one of the cops said. Hans took a stick and pulled the edge of the dark green coat up. And the coat, Russian too. The label's in Cyrillic. Looks like he's been dead a month or more, don't you think? Hans asked. At least that long. His head's bashed in. You couldn't survive a fall like this, the shorter cop said. The tall officer took one picture and then another, wiping the rain away from his eyes. It'll have to do, he said. I took a few before it got so bad. He slipped the camera into the large pocket on his jacket and snapped it shut. They placed the body as carefully as they could into the black bag and zipped it. Hans bent and touched the ground, moved his hands around the rocks. He could almost feel the weight of the bones on the slick surface of sharp stones. It was lightly snowing now, and they strapped the body to the metal stretcher and attached it to the ropes. The two cops, more experienced climbers than Hans, moved along with the stretcher, steadying it over the jagged outcrops as their colleagues above pulled it slowly up the cliff. Hans was alone in the gorge for a few minutes. He could hear the helicopter taking off. There were so many kinds of death. This was a solitary one. Even the birds had eaten their fill and left the remains. The tufts of dark hair curled around the man's ear. The body so easily dismembered. And it took so much energy to keep the heart churning year after year, only to have your body split apart and decay on the rocks in the ravine. His first death on the job was a woman. The neighbors reported a smell. The whole street was full of it. A summer day, a rare week of sun, and the body festering for 3 days in the small apartment not far from where he lived in Oslo. The woman bloated, her young face blown up and mottled like a balloon. She had no family in Oslo. They lived on an island off the west coast and had no idea she was dead. That was a long time ago. He was belayed up finally, snow thick on his hat and gloves. The shorter cop laughed and said, "You sure you can find your way to the village?" "I'll just follow your snowmobile tracks," Hans said. "At least take this headlamp," the cop said. "We'll meet you there." Hans skied fast back to Lismavari, over the winding trail and down the hill. So dark this time of year. There was just an hour or so of light left. Across the small birch woods, the land sloped down to the river, tatters of bark. He'd forgotten how beautiful it was in the forest, how fresh the air was on the Vidda, the softness of the light. The snow was perfect. He was flying along past bristly willow thickets and clusters of birch. He never had much time off from work to ski, but it was something he should do more often. The rush of flying downhill, curving right and left on the velvet surface of the snow. No thought at all, just the motion of his body. A buzzard swooped in a wide circle overhead, a swish of wings. Around him, the whole arc of the world spread out in luminous white. It was easy to slip across the flat surface of the snow, pounded down by snowmobiles. Thank you.
Okay, and now it's time for a little Q&A with Sharon and Anita.
Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Anita.
Congratulations on If the Owl Calls. It's a beautiful
Thank
book.
you. Thank you.
It's pretty complex and layered with multiple threads. And so let's start broad. What were the origins of this novel for you? When did you first start working on it, and what prompted you to start working on it?
I actually started writing about this place, Finnmark, a long time ago because I lived there for a while and I almost moved there, but I didn't start thinking about a novel for a long time until I really felt like I think about 15 years ago when it seemed like the climate change was really affecting the Arctic. Um, and um, and the whole idea of this incredibly beautiful place being threatened by the change in the climate. Um, and it's funny to think about it right now, but I'm sure it was at least 15 years ago that there, people started to think about this and write about it. And it's amazing that even now it's just feels like we haven't, we've gone backwards instead of going forwards. But anyhow, I started to think about what I wanted to write about, and I wanted to tell this story, and started with the idea of Catherine, and then this person that I had actually seen when I lived in Finnmark in the river fishing. Um, and I thought it was really weird because he was an American and there were really no Americans where I was, that part north, not that I knew of. And it seemed very strange. And I thought, well, is he CIA? Is he, who is he? So it seemed like he was a good spark for the book. And then he got left behind in one of the early drafts. But I really wanted to, I decided that a mystery might be the best way to tell the story. I loved reading mysteries, and I just, it began, and I had no idea that it was going to be so difficult to put the pieces of the book together. Um, it took a while, but it really was because I wanted to give the sense of how incredibly beautiful it was there.
Yeah, and you do that really well. So you started with Catherine. Why set the book in 1979? What drew you to that year in particular?
I think because I was there in a little bit earlier than that, like the mid 1970s.
Mm,
And then I started reading about the Alta Dam protests. And that was the key, I felt, to, to somehow structuring the book. So that's why it became set a little bit later in the 1970s.
right. So you weren't there during the Alta Dam
No.
protest, but can you tell us a little bit about your research into that and into Norway in general?
Yeah,
The Sami
I into what?
and into the Sami people.
Yeah, I actually, when I was there, I lived with a Sami family. And when I went back about 10 years later, I was going to move to the same village, and then decided not to for several reasons. So I knew I had been told a lot of stories by the people in the village, and really became interested in Johan Turi, who's in the book, and his book. And so I'd had the book forever and never thought of using it, in a book. But he became part of the book as I wrote more and more about it. There's a lot of information about the Alta Dam protests, um, and also there was some information, quite a lot of information about this, something that Tori writes about, this rebellion in in northern Norway at a certain point in this village. So I had a lot of information that I'd gathered from different places.
Was it a Sami rebellion or?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a
It
little bit more?
was against, it sort of complicated the history of Norway and Sweden. At one point, they were one country, and I'm not a historian, so and I don't have notes about it right here. But so there was this rebellion against the against um, I'm trying to think this shopkeeper who was selling alcohol to people in the village, and he was a really bad influence, really horrible, and a priest who seemed to be, aligned with him, and it's a really interesting story. And I actually watched this great movie about it that I had been sent by someone in Texas. A big study, a big department that of people at I can't remember which university in Texas, but of people who study Sami history.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And the painter Emily Demont Hat also becomes a part of the novel. And my understanding is that she was helping Johann Tori with his manuscripts. Is that right?
Yeah, that was really interesting because I had this book, this wonderful, I don't know whether I have the copy right here. It's a wonderful old book, Turi's Book of Lapland. I don't know whether you can see it. And I had this book forever because one of my friends in Norway had given it to me in Finnmark. And I was looking at it, and it said, on the front, it says edited and translated into Danish by Amelia Demont Hott. And I thought, well, wait a minute, who is this person? And so I started researched into her life, and it took me. I traveled all over Scandinavia, tracking her down, basically, and talking to other people too who were fascinated by her. So yeah, she always wanted to go on a migration with the Sami people from when she was a little kid. I can't remember how she found out about their lifestyle, but she met Johann Turi on a train when she was on sort of a vacation from art school. She was an amazing person. She went to art school. She fell in love with Carl Nielsen, the composer, and they sort of had an affair when she was really young. And then he moved to Copenhagen. This was in Denmark, in northern Denmark, where they met. But she was in I think her early 30s, and she went to art school in Copenhagen. And she was on this trip and met Johann Turi, who told her he wanted to write a book about his history, about the history of uh, Samis. And so she learned to speak Sami, and he had already written this book, but she helped translate it and helped in some ways to edit it and organize it. And then they found a publisher who was actually a rich mine owner in northern Sweden, who then published the book. And the edition that I first read was translated by someone in England whose name it was. C.G. Nash, who also turns out to be a woman. So it's sort of an interesting story how this material got folded into the book. And at first, I thought that Amelia's letters were going to be a huge part of the book. And I kept paring them back and back.
Mm.
And, several people said, no, you can't have all those letters.
Oh no, really?
Yes.
Oh, we get
Take
to
those
read.
letters out.
What did you hope that they would add to the novel?
I wanted her point of view because she was so important well, once I had Johann Tori as a relative of Hans, she was just so important to him. And then it became, I thought it was sort of interesting that as the book developed, then Hans starts hearing her speak. And I also thought it was important because she, like Catherine, was an outsider who was trying to be part of, just fell in love with this culture in sort of a romantic, not sort of, but a romantic way. And so that they're outsiders and their voices are, the outsider. And of course, I'm telling this story from the outside too. So I thought all those overlapping ideas were interesting.
Mm. And Hans is kind of the main protagonist. He wrestles a lot with his Sami identity. Can you talk a little bit about how you conceived of his character and sort of his evolution through the book? And he starts out sort of not quite understanding the dam protests, and I'm curious to know more about, how you conceived of all of that.
Well, as you know, as a writer, you're not necessarily thinking about what's happening to your characters and how they're evolving. But I just started out thinking that Hans was wanted to be cut off from who he was
Mm.
for lots of different reasons. You find out in the book different reasons why he felt cut off from who he was and his family, cut off from his brother. But the more that he understands, actually, he sees more things through Amelia's eyes to a certain extent, her letters and how she sees things, and also comes to understand through his relationship, which becomes sort of a friendship with one of the suspects, Olaf. How things are much more complicated than they seem to him at the beginning. He feels like the dam just means more lights in the winter and more making life easier, but it's not so simple.
Mm.
And I think that just sort of evolved as the book went on.
Yeah, yeah. How did you decide on the structure, like moving back and forth between these two different timelines and these two different characters, Hans and Catherine's perspectives?
That took a really long time to figure out because I started out and I had lots of different, I had several points of view. Gunther, the German student, had, he had his chapters. There were a couple of other people who were part of the whole, it was more like a tapestry than what it ended up being. And the
Mm.
time, the structure was much more complicated. There were lots of flashbacks, and finally I just decided that it was too complicated, too confusing, too many voices. And then it seemed like Hans was the center of the book, not Catherine. Her story was just a
Mm.
part of his story. And I wanted to wanted to have her story not going side by side with Hans's story, that they would catch up to each other by the end. And also for the whole structure of the mystery, I think it made more sense to have it that way, finally, after many drafts.
Did you use any sort of techniques? I know some writers will write on their, on big sheets of paper, what's happening in these multiple timelines. Did you use any sort of techniques or methods to keep track of all this? Because I think it'd be somewhat complicated to track.
Yeah, I'm not like that. I don't use graphs and things, but I did end up going through lots of notebooks, sort of outlining it by hand, and then going through the book and seeing exactly what was happening, because at some points I just lost track. But it would have been much better to have big sheets of paper and draw
Not
it.
necessarily.
No, I
I
think
was just
no.
curious.
I think it would have been better, but I eventually figured it out.
Yeah. I mean, I just think that's such a hefty task to go back and forth between February before Hans gets involved and then his investigation to unspool at the right pacing. Like, how did you decide, what did you just write your way through it essentially? Or like, are you somebody who has, some kind of outline or some kind of sense of what has to happen in one chapter to fit with the next chapter, which is from a different perspective? Or
No, I don't plan it very well. And I think it's because I've been writing poetry for a really long time. And um, I think I had a lot more material, and that's really how I whittled it down so that I felt like it worked finally. And I moved the pieces around. So instead of having it in my head, often when I write, things are all over the floor, and I move the chapters around like a puzzle. So that's how
okay, so you do have a visual, it's
I
like
do
some
have a
kind of visual
visual.
thing.
Yes, yes, it's usually on the floor. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about developing Catherine's story and how you wanted that piece of the novel to work with Hans's story. Like, these are sort of characters who are in very different places. And since she was the character that came first, I'm just curious, like, you probably had to whittle away pages of her viewpoint, but like what was your governing principle and like what you were going to keep and whatnot?
Yeah, I did have to I did have to chop a lot of her viewpoint, and I thought that she had a story that began a lot earlier than it begins in the book, and a story that ended a lot later. So I basically chopped off the beginning and chopped off the end, and condensed. I wanted it to be focused on her time in Lismavari, and um, not any other pieces of her life, and to show
Mm.
what had happened to her in this place. Um,
Do you think you're going to write about her in another book, or since you've done so much sketching out of her, her trajectory?
yeah, maybe, yeah. Um, I'm not sure right now. I got involved in writing about this artist in New Zealand, and I've finished a draft of that book, so we'll see what happens
Mm.
after that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about this already, but you write landscape beautifully. What's the role of, place and travel in your work more broadly? Like, not just this book, but your other books as well?
I think it's just part of who I am. I've always, I mean, it sounds so dumb, but I've always wanted to just be outside, and um, be part of the natural world, if that sounds sort of dopey, but you know, for a while I wanted to be an outward bound instructor. It's this program that goes out into the mountains and or different places besides mountains, and I just wanted to be outside. But then I tried leading some tours for American youth hostels, and it was horrible. It was so awful having to deal with these kids who didn't want to be on these bike trips or hiking trips. So I ended up, you know, teaching, but I just love being in places like Catherine that feel like they're wild, um, or feel like you're actually taking part in um, being in the world, the whole world, not just the human world.
Mm. How do you see this novel fitting into your body of work more broadly? I think it sounds like, just looking at your bio, it sounds like travel has sort of inspired you in other books as well. But beyond that, how do you see your own trajectory with books?
It's a really interesting question because I never thought of my work as a body of work before. But I visited my sister in North Carolina, and she's been giving a neighbor my books. And so I'd met him, and he said, well, you know, you have such an interesting body of work. And I think I've just sort of thought of each project as I went along, um, not thinking of it as part of um, you know, as having any meaning in the series of works, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
for this idea, I needed to have a pretty big canvas, a pretty big space to tell the story or stories that I wanted to tell. And in a lot of my poetry, I use, you know, it's a lot of prose in the poetry too. So I, you know, I can't really, I guess I can't answer that question,
Okay.
which seems, you know, sort of strange, but I think it's just each project has been the form that seems to fit what I wanted to do with it.
Mm. So each book in your mind stands alone, completely alone.
Not completely alone because they overlap. You know, I have written about this place before in poetry and in this memoir that I wrote, Field Notes. So it does feel like it feels like for me going to Finnmark, going to Norway, really was the spark for a lot of my work.
Mm. Were you a writer back then, or?
Yeah. I started writing, and you know, actually I talked to this person a couple weeks ago who said most writers tell him that they started writing when they were in about fourth grade, which is when I started writing.
Mm.
I thought that was funny.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But
And
I
you,
thought of myself as a poet.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think a lot of people who come to writing fiction actually do write a lot of poetry early on.
Yeah.
It's not
Did you write poetry early
Yeah,
on?
I mean, I used to write both stories and poetry when I was younger. But
Yeah.
But then somehow the poetic spark left me, I think, because then I got sort of taken over by prose.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
it's still in your at least the stories that I read. It's still in how we know each
That's interesting.
other. Yeah.
Yeah. What are you working on now? That I'll close out with that question.
As I said, I went to New Zealand. I retired and then I went to New Zealand. My husband had a sabbatical, and I'd always wanted to go to New Zealand. Um, and I think I read a National Geographic article that talked about this woman who lived on a sheep farm in New Zealand, and it sounded just like the most amazing place. Of course, it would have been really difficult to live on that sheep farm in New Zealand. But I had a residency in this house that was painter Anna Castleberg and her husband's a poet, John Castleberg's house. They died in 2004. And now the house is you can go as an artist and live there. And I lived there for a winter. And some of her paintings were on the walls, and I asked people about her, but they all seem really vague about her. So I got interested in finding out more about who she was. So this project really is my answer to who she was. Um, it's it's uh it's been really challenging because and really exciting because I've been able to interview people all over New Zealand who knew Anna Castleberg.
Mm.
And it's really, and I actually went back to New Zealand and met quite a few people and have seen her work. And her father was one of the most famous painters in New Zealand. And that's sort of the problem because um, people, when she was alive, kept saying, well, she's not as good as her father, or she's better than her father. And so now I do have a manuscript, um, and I have a painter in New Zealand who's going to do some illustrations for it. But it's been really hard to write because there's a friend actually read it. I think she might be here tonight. She told me she was going to arrive in her pajamas, my friend Karen Donovan, but she said it's like I'm putting together this archive of Anna's work. It's her letters and all these different pieces. So right now I'm not sure that it actually works, but we'll see.
Well, we're excited to read it. Neri, do you want to come back and
Hey, that was great, you guys. I'm still thinking about the shuffling the chapters like a puzzle piece on the ground. I'm still thinking about that. So we want to open up the floor to questions now. If anybody has a question, please drop it into the chat and I'll read them. Ilse Duarte says, in your novels, not only is the setting a foreign country, but at least one main character is a foreigner there. What does this condition, being a foreigner, contribute to character development and the narrative as a whole?
I don't know. No, it's um I think again, as I said before, that uh the whole idea of being someone who is a foreigner, an outsider in a culture, and trying to define that culture or trying to portray it. It's this it is the idea of telling the story. So and that's Gunter actually tells the story of his family's experience during World War II. So he's got his own sense of this conflict of being an outsider, an insider, seeing the story from different angles, I think.
The forest says, you talked in a recent interview about the ways that Catherine is changed by the landscape in Finland. Can you talk a bit about how the landscape changed you when you lived there?
Yeah, I went to Norway thinking that there were going to be these huge mountains, which there are in different parts of Norway. But when I got to Finnmark, I thought it was really ugly. I did. I thought it was, I was really disappointed. A lot of the villages were burned by the Germans when they were occupying that part of Norway. So the buildings are pretty, they were pretty new in the 1970s. And I just, I was really homesick, and I thought, what am I going to do here? This is awful. And then I started to take long walks out into the forest, and the flowers started coming up, and it was just incredibly beautiful. And the farm I was on had sheep and cows, and like Catherine, I started to really think that this was an incredibly beautiful place.
Wow. Okay. Janice says, the natural world is so important to your work. How do animals specifically figure into the narrative of this book, do you think?
Well, the the lives of the animals are really important to the people in the book. The Lismavari, the people are farmers, cows, the cows and the sheep are part of their lives. The if the reindeer herders that Amelia Dumont Hott spends time with, the reindeer are their lives. The owls and buzzards and hawks that Hans becomes interested in are, really important to the book.
Janice says, was it a challenge to write from a male character's perspective?
Uh, I don't think so. I didn't feel like it was. I think because I had written this collection of short fiction called Boiling Lake, and a lot of those pieces they're from the perspectives of stones and male characters, female characters, and I think some are from animals. So I think I didn't really think about it. If that makes sense. Yeah. Thanks, Leah.
Hey, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you to Sharon and Anita for this really enlightening conversation about the book. I'm really excited to have this book out in the world, and you can get a copy and support our press at WTAW Press website, linked in the chat. Thank you all again, and have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.